Dwight Hoover, Dwighthoover.
You can look at me, you don't have to look directly at the camera. So. And now just state your name. My name is?
My name is Dwight Hoover. I'm the retired history professor at Ball State and director of the Center for Middletown Studies.
Founding director. Yes. Okay. And tell us a little bit about since we're talking about Warner Gear and you've written about Warner Gear, just describe a little bit sort of your qualifications for the interview, in effect, what kind of work you've done.
Well, I started out as an intellectual historian, history of ideas, went into social history, taught black history for a while, then ended up in urban history. So I was a kind of hybrid, but my major emphasis in my latter years of research was on urban history, particularly on Muncie.
And what kind of work did you do related to Warner Gear?
I had a grant from T.J. Alt, who had worked at Warner Gear, to do a kind of history of the plant. And so I proceeded to do research on that, particularly concentrated on the years prior to World War II.
Okay. And so that's where you completed your manuscript, Automobility?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I want to begin at the beginning. We'll talk a little bit about sort of the rise of industry in Muncie. In your manuscript, you sort of start with the almost pre-gas boom industrial history of the city. If you could talk a little bit about those developments.
Okay, Muncie started to develop, I think, in the 1880s with the Bryce building, Irishman who came in, who actually worked on hemp.
You mean Bryce or Boyce?
Boyce.
Okay.
The Boyce. He built the Boyce building, one of the few buildings to be electrified in Muncie. And then there was a period of industrialization, largely brought about by the gas boom. When the gas petered out in the early 1900s, a group of local entrepreneurs tried to find some way to replace it, some kinds of things to do it. They tried to get, for example, Maxwell, which was a precursor of Chrysler, to build cars here. But Newcastle got it instead. And so they decided to build their own automobile, which was the Interstate. Among the people who did it was, of course, the Ball family. But starting in that time, they had a new kind of reindustrialization, I called it. They brought in a number of people, actually 5 brothers from Tennessee, the Warner brothers. One of the Warners, who was the inventor, had patented a doorbell. And he and his brothers all some way got involved in the electrification of the period. So they came to Muncie. Originally, he came to install electrical equipment, particularly the doorbells that he had invented, a double ringing doorbell. And that's how they got started, as an electrical company in Muncie.
What's the connection between that and Warner Gear?
Well, Warner Gear is named after the Warner brothers. They started out with Warner Electric, that was their plant, making electrical equipment and so on. But the one Warner that was the inventor was tinkering in his garage, and he made a differential gear. And then they started selling it and manufacturing it as part of Warner Electric. They got a big boost in the early 1900s when they went to an auto show and were there selling the differential. They only made a few of them and encountered Random Olds, who was the early originator of the Oldsmobile. And he bought thousands of differentials, more than they could manufacture. So they realized they were in the auto parts business and started an auto parts plant, they had a number of investors, and that was the beginning of Warner Gear. Now, for a time, the two were together. Warner Electric, Warner Gear were simultaneous. But eventually, some of the local entrepreneurs in Muncie invested in the plant. And by 1910, we have pretty much Warner Gear started. It's really doing well in 1910. What happens, though, eventually is that the Warner brothers lose control to the other entrepreneurs and are out of the business. Actually, one of the Warners moves to Toledo, Ohio, and opens his own business there. There's quite a lawsuit at the time of the split because the entrepreneurs said that he took some of the blueprints for making what they were making, differentials, transmissions, and so on, with him up to Toledo. In any case, he started making them there and eventually was bought out by Chevrolet and became a part owner in General Motors. And he eventually came back to Muncie. But the Warner plant then was extant from then on.
Okay, I want to continue with Warner Gear's development. Before that, though, I want to go back and fill in a few things. One of the things I really like in your manuscript is your sort of description of industrial life in Muncie before the gas boom, really, or at least before the Ball brothers and Warner Gear get going. And you talk about different industries. One of them you talk about is roller skating. For a little while, Muncie was the roller skate capital of the country, it seemed. Could you talk a little bit about that and other businesses going on pre-gas boom?
Yeah, well, roller skating came out of the Kitzelman family. The Kitzelmans were located elsewhere, and they invented the roller skate. Well, they didn't invent the roller skate, but roller skating became a popular pastime in the 1880s. And they moved to Muncie. It became Indiana Wire, but they originally were roller skating, and they shipped roller skates all over the world. They also had roller skating rinks in Muncie, and that was one of the first industries that really took off.
So that kind of stuff lays the groundwork for the later manufacturing operations that establishes that culture.
That's right. And glass became important with the discovery of natural glass in the 1890s. And every little town had glass factories, but Muncie had the advantage of being a transportation nexus and having the ability to grow. They had the infrastructure. They were bringing in a lot of immigrants, but at the same time, they were bringing in a lot of farm boys who were then becoming workers in the industrial plants. So they had that development going as a kind of pre-industrial condition. They had the labor, they had the capital. The Ball brothers moved from Buffalo there, bringing money with them. And the early industrialization was a good deal dependent upon early capitalization. And they had the advantage there of having people who were willing to invest and had the wherewithal to invest.
Okay, you talked about also the Warner brothers. I want to go back to them a little bit. At one point you used the word tinkering or tinkler. Another point you talked about them as entrepreneurs, and they're kind of both. And so if you could talk a little more about their background, the reasons for their success. I'm particularly interested, it's Hugh Warner, I believe, who's the person who figures out the differential gear. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. I think I'm right.
That's what I remember from your manuscript. If you could talk a little bit about that and more of the sort of the character and the way that the Warners operated in particular in coming up with this idea. Also, if you go back, I think when you talked about the story of them going to the meeting where they meet ransom holds, you described them as random holds, or you used the name
ransom.
So yeah, just sort of repeat that a little bit, so we have the right name.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, They went in different directions. At the start, they all left Tennessee and went to different places, but they all became involved technically in some kind of electrical work. The era was largely an era of electrification, but they all kind of coalesced in Muncie. That is to say, they came to Muncie after they got the contract to do electrifying some of the town of Muncie. Now, prior to electrification, Muncie had coal gas, which was largely derived from burning coal and gasifying it. And then this was an era when they started switching to electricity. And the Warners that got here first asked their other brothers to come. Some of them, most of them were involved in some facet of the electrical generating industry. And that was the know-how that they brought in with them. Now, when they, Tinkerer discovered or invented new differential gear, he went to an auto show and met Ransom Olds and sold him a lot of differential gears. But that was their background. They were tinkerers, they were electricians, they were people who were willing to go ahead and to exploit that particular skill.
So is it a combination of their know-how and local capital investment, the Ball brothers, the Johnsons, I think were the other big investors?
Johnsons in particular, yeah. Yeah, every little town in Indiana made automobiles. If you looked, I think there's somewhat over 200 auto manufacturers. The reason Muncie went ahead was, again, the bankers were willing to lend them money. I think if you look at the history of Indiana, Indianapolis should have been the Detroit of the period. They had more innovation. They had as good a cars as anybody. But what Ford's advantage was not only his tinkering and his early cars, but the bankers lent him the money. So there's money left over from the gas boom in Muncie. The Ball brothers have money because they've had gas, and there are other plants too that are there because of cheap energy. So you have that boost at the start that other cities in the area don't have. Yeah.
Good, thanks. All right, well, we were talking about Warner Gear, and by about 1910, they're a thriving concern making differential gears and so forth. And then in the ensuing decade or two, they grow dramatically. If you could perhaps talk about that and some of the reasons for that.
Well, first there's World War I. Now it kills the interstate, the Ball automobile. They never recover after World War I, but it greatly increases the number of automobiles in the country. World War I killed a lot of horses, and it meant that you had to find a substitute for horsepower. That meant tractors, but it also meant trucks. It also meant automobiles. And by the 1920s, Muncie had become a center of automobile development. The man who joined with Warner, who won back General Motors, who is his name? I'm forgetting the name. Billy.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. Durant.
Yeah, Billy Durant actually joined with Warner to help with Chevrolet to take over General Motors. They took over General Motors, and then Billy lost General Motors because of his tendency towards stock speculation, but he set up his own automobile company. And in the 20s, they started making automobiles in Muncie. Durant had his plant here. He built a competitor to the Chevrolet and to some of the other models that Chevrolet and General Motors had. That proved a big stimulus to the automobile parts industry in Muncie in the 1920s. The Linds, when they came here in the 20s, identified the Balls as the leading industrial plant in the city, but auto parts by the 1920s had outstripped glass as an industry in the town. Billy Durant actually lost his control of Durant, went broke in stock market speculation in the crash of '29, but that didn't stop the Warner plant. In 1929, they joined with a Swede who was manufacturing clutches, a man by the name of Borg, near Chicago, and that became BorgWarner. And from then on, BorgWarner became a significant auto parts developer. Actually, as T.J. Alt told me, the Warner plant was a cash cow for BorgWarner. It made more of the money. Borg really didn't contribute that much. And then in the 1930s, the BorgWarner plant, or the Warner Gear plant, as it was then known, became important because they had the first successful automatic drive. And it was invented by a fellow, again, a tinkerer, that was hired and paid for out of the petty cash funds. During the Depression, when other car companies were going broke, other parts companies were going broke, Warner Gear continued because they had this fellow who the president saw had mechanical talent enough to develop the early automatic transmissions, which is, by the way, about the only invention that is Native American. Almost all the rest are European or other developments, but it was singularly an American invention.
The automatic transmission.
Yes.
Did you say that again? Did you say the automatic transmission?
The automatic transmission was one of the significant and only American technological development in automobiles. And during the years of the Depression, Warner Gear continued to do quite well, and of course really expanded in World War II.
And so Warner Gear had a key role in the development of this major piece of automotive machinery.
Well, they did, because they invented this transmission. Yeah.
Okay. All that's great. Let's a little more about the significance of the merger with Borg, because you talk about this in your manuscript as it's one of the moments when control of the firm and of this whole industry moved out of local hands and into distant places.
Okay, this happens all along, but this happens at this particular time because the amalgamation of the two means that the headquarters move to a different place, and BorgWarner then centers in Chicago, I believe. And so the decisions are made by stockholders in the new company who aren't necessarily that connected with the local community. We still have people in the local community who are important investors and who earn a good deal of their money from BorgWarner, but the decisions are made in a company that's removed, at least one removed from the community. A kind of development that continues to this day And that, in the end, I think is what does in Warner Gear, because the decisions, certainly in the 90s and in the early year of this century, meant that they were making transmissions and other gears somewhere else.
Great, that's good. Before we sort of move forward a little bit and move on to some other topics, can you talk a little bit perhaps about the experience of workers at the Warner Gear plants in this era up into the 30s?
The Warners were always, Warner Gear rather, was always anti-union down to fairly recent times. It was both the continuation of a kind of anti-union problem here. They felt again that they used local labor. This was what they said. They brought in local farm boys who didn't have much experience with unions, and they brought them in who were people who were maybe educated at grade school or lower levels, and put them to work in the factory. The unionization came in the 1930s with a national government dominated by Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, which pushed unionization and gave federal protection to union workers. It's only in World War II that really much more is accomplished as far as the workers. They are able to make more demands. We're getting workers that are imported from the South, people who move in, particularly from Tennessee and the other border states who work in Warner Gear. And it's a path of mobility for workers. So you have workers here who are maybe new people in the community. So we're getting a workforce that's a little bit different than it was earlier. And since jobs were available here, the union was able to make demands. And we know what happened in the 1950s. In the 1950s, there was an agreement made on the national level, particularly with auto workers, that dictated that instead of getting wage increases so much, they would get a number of benefits. So they got the best benefits that they could get, benefits that are only now being taken away. When I first came to Muncie in 1959, my salary was less than someone who was a high school graduate, or even not a high school graduate, who was pushing a broom at Warner Gear. He made more on an annual level than I did, and his benefits were better. The benefits would include eye care, get glasses, paying maybe $1 for a prescription drug, something like that. So gradually, the developments were such that the workers became more and more middle class. My neighbor in the last house I lived in Muncie worked for Warner Gear. He had better benefits, a nicer house, probably made more money than I did, and it was a heyday of unionization.
That was great. I want to ask you to say one thing again, which is the part about the BorgWarner working, you said makes more than I did. Say, if you could say makes more than I did as a professor.
Yes.
Just say that again, because that was great.
Yes, when I came to Muncie in 1959 as an assistant professor at the university, I made less money and had poorer benefits than a worker at Warner Gear.
Terrific. That was good. With regard to, I'm going to go in a little bit different order than I planned because we're sort of on this topic now. Could you talk about or narrate a little bit the formation of Local 287, which is the Warner Gear local, You have a fairly good description in your manuscript, and so I mean, as much as you can recall and talk about.
Gee, that's something that I've pretty much forgotten. When did that occur?
37, they form. They have a 2-year contract. In 39, they the 2 years are up, and they have a strike to get another contract. It's very it's heated. There's a couple strikes again during World War II. I think 43 and 45.
Mm-hmm.
At several junctures, there's periods where the two sides are taking turns taking out full-page ads in a local paper, arguing their case to each other,
Mm-hmm.
and so the town becomes, I think, pretty consumed by this
Mm-hmm.
process.
Mm-hmm. There was always, I think, some kind of resentment between the workers in Muncie and the people who owned the factories. This resentment was in part due to the republicanism of the people who had invested in the company, and the 30s were the era of sit-down strikes. There was a big one in Anderson in 37. There was continued labor difficulties. There continued strikes in order to win concessions from the management in the late 1930s, 37, 39. And in the war years, there were threatened strikes and threatened slowdowns in order to wring concessions from the management. Management was not able to fight them too successfully because of their war production work. So in the end, they was a matter of advancement for the union.
Warren Vanderhill a couple of years ago was doing a series of oral histories, first with members of organized labor, and then also a little later with people involved in economic development efforts in recent decades locally. And in both cases, he was talking to people, and there was a broad sort of sense that Muncie, for a good while, had a reputation as a tough union town, a place that experienced a number of strikes, had a good deal of labor management conflict. Is that right? And could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think it is. I think Muncie was a tough labor town. Actually, there was a long tradition of strikes. There was a streetcar strike in, I think, 1907. There was always that kind of division between the management, between the political structure and the management of local plants and the unions. It was a tough town. I don't know that it was any tougher than Anderson. Both of them seemed to have parallel careers. It probably was tougher than smaller towns where the union had less clout. But I don't think Muncie deservedly was a much tougher town than anywhere else. There were those continuing attitudes of a division between the so-called working class and the upper class. We did an interview project in the mid-70s of people about work, and we encountered one or two people who were workers who said that they wouldn't come across the river to the north side of town because they didn't want them there. The people who lived on this side didn't want the people from the south side to come over. And one fellow, extreme case, wouldn't shop in Muncie. He would go down to Newcastle to buy groceries and so on because he felt that there was this kind of class warfare between working class and middle class people in the town.
You know, how much do you think the roots of that antagonism lie in the attitudes of workers versus the sort of anti-union sentiments of the Warners and Balls and others in town? And, any sense of what the roots are of that?
I always thought that there was a political connection in the pre-World War I period. The Ball family was very much Republican, as it continues probably to this day. And they split over progressivism. They split over the problem of Teddy Roosevelt and the new Progressive Party. But they had a mayor, Doc Bunch, who was a local doctor, who was connected with criminal element in town. Muncie was notorious for a number of things, not so much, I think, anti-union attitudes, but because there was a red light district, there were criminals, there were scams going on, and the mayor was put in federal penitentiary for using the mails to defraud and in connection with the scam. Now, the mayor was connected also with the Warners. Mayor Doc Bunch was connected with the Warners, and I think if he had been successful and not sent to the federal penitentiary, there might have been a little bit of a little less union activity, a little less antagonisms. The Ku Klux Klan came to Muncie, I'm pretty convinced, as a Republican maneuver to defeat the mayor. And so we have the Ku Klux Klan is very active in Muncie in the 1920s, which is anti-Catholic, anti-Black, anti-Semitic. And in a sense, it's seen as a kind of anti-worker, although a lot of workers were involved in it. So there is an assumption that this is all connected together, that the political and economic conjoin at that particular time. So I think that there is an antagonism that's developed that's all as economic, but it's also political.
Great. Now, one other quick question. You mentioned that a lot of the workers that come to Muncie come from the South, from Tennessee and other border states. Was that an intentional thing? Did firms recruit in that region? And if so, was it because they thought they might get workers who were less inclined to go on strike and join unions?
Sure. There was a deliberate attempt to recruit workers from the South. In particular, there's a town in Tennessee, Jamestown, Tennessee, that Ball brothers recruited from. And they recruited from them because there's more economic opportunity in Muncie than there was in Tennessee at the time, because these workers were pretty happy to get anything, right? And they tended to congregate in churches or communities by themselves. They didn't integrate into the community, so there's a difficulty in trying to organize a union because you have people from different backgrounds and different cultural assumptions. So I think I think that's deliberate. That's true with the farm boys, local farm boys, but it's also true particularly during the Depression and during World War II. Bring in people from outside because shortage of labor here and so on. Yeah.
Great, thanks. I want to circle back and cover a couple of things that we didn't get to before. What was it like to work at Warner Gear before unions? Do you have any sense of that?
There was no. I know that they tend to have a 54-hour week. There wasn't any overtime, that sort of thing. It was primarily do a day's work, get a day's pay, and work all week. Have maybe some time off Saturday late, but no, it was largely. If you didn't like it here, you can go somewhere else and find a job. Yeah, it was fairly primitive. You know, it was normal what people expected, I guess. working in a factory. We found people who said that they wanted to work in the factory because of cash money. They lived on a farm and they didn't have any cash money. So they would be willing to come in and work because this was cash money that enabled them to buy products that they wanted.
Real quick, just a reminder, tell this down Tennessee. That last part was great. We had no idea what he was talking about because he didn't say before unions came into BorgWarner or nothing like that. So
Okay.
it was a great part. But if we just took that by itself, we have no idea what you're talking about because we won't hear him.
Okay.
Okay. Well, when you're ready, try that again, just before unions came. That was, even if we get the first part, we can probably find a way to edit it. Yeah. So, something similar, beginning with before unions came, when he's ready. Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
Well, before the unions came, the great attraction of Warner Gear and other plants in town was that they paid cash money. In the era before World War I, farmers were self-sufficient. They really didn't have much of an ad campaign aimed at the consumer to buy products. In the 1920s, we had the great age of advertising, and now people are buying cars, they're buying consumer products. And in order to get cash money, you had to work in a factory or you had to work in a business. You couldn't just make it on farm products because remember, in the 1920s, there's a farm depression that starts in 21 and lasts until World War II. So there's a great encouragement for people who are subsistence or even a little bit larger farmers than this to come in and work at Warner Gear.
Also, again, beginning with before unions came, talk about the 54-hour week. You can,
Yeah, okay.
You can go, you take it or leave it.
Yeah. People who came to work had to work under conditions set by the management, which meant working on Saturday, 54-hour week, which meant getting there on time, following all the rules, that regardless of the dangers or other problems that inhered in factory work. But if you didn't do it, then you didn't work there anymore.
Good. Don't try to look at the camera too much. You'll come off looking odd.
I look odd enough as it is.
I have that problem. Okay, that's good. Did that work? You got what you need?
Oh yeah, it was just kind of a reminder too.
Yeah.
In general.
Generally speaking, yeah. I lose track of that too.
It's easy because it's an unnatural way of speaking.
Yeah. In your manuscript, you talk a bit about efforts of the company to keep their workers happy, the social life connected with it, a little bit of the welfare capitalism policies of the late teens and 20s as well. And in particular, I want you to talk about those kinds of things, the picnics, the ball games, the baseball teams, so forth, that they provide. And in particular, you have this great description of a picnic that takes place in August of 1919. 4,000 people. Baseball games, bands, lectures. It's apparently in response to a picnic that another company had a week earlier.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of, we'll show you,
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing. I don't know how much you remember of those details, but if you want to talk about that a little bit.
I think I know the reasons for them. The company tried to build employee morale, but it was largely to find unifying forces among a disparate labor force. And that in a time when people were pretty much starved for entertainment, it evolved on providing sports opportunity. Town industry would sponsor a baseball team. You would have annual picnics. You would have various other occasions where the workforce and their families could get together. And in an era when people aren't that much involved in local churches and so on, church attendance is supposedly going down. Uh, the movies are just starting. There are a number of opportunities in industrial work that you wouldn't get if you lived in a more isolated rural community or in the South. So the company provided those opportunities.
Did the company have any ulterior motives? You know, in other words, oftentimes these kinds of things are a way to unify the workers without unions.
Sure, the companies always had a paternalistic look. They always said, okay, we'll provide for you. We are willing to consider what you want. We're paternalistic. I noticed it was interesting what John Fisher said about the Ball Corporation, that when he was in charge, that one Christmas he got very generous and he told all his workers they should quit work and go home, but it was 4:45. It was 15 minutes before time to go home anyway. But the items they gave them in that spirit of paternalism, which I think was genuine. I think there was a genuine spirit of looking after the workers, more of a sense that they're our children, they're our people that we look out for in turn, for which they give us their labor.
Is that part of the reason why they were so hostile toward unions?
I think so, yeah. We're trying to do our best. We're hostile toward unions because they're destroying the relationship that we have. There's assumption that there is a family, that the factory is a family. A kind of early industrial assumption, I think.
Great, good. The other sort of other piece I want to fill in a little bit, moving back, is, you know, in many ways, you mentioned earlier that the Linds sort of perhaps mistakenly assumed that glass making is the big industry when really it's auto parts, particularly transmissions. So, I mean, would you say, what would you say is the role of the transmission business, particularly in the city, and the auto industry more generally, in sort of developing the city?
Well, an automobile analyst once said Muncie had as many automobiles in the 1920s as France had in 1975. That is, the percentage of automobile ownership was the highest in the area. It was higher than the national average by far. One of the Linds insights was that people desired automobiles before they wanted indoor plumbing. And one of their famous quotations that's always found when you read the Linds is that they asked a woman, why is that the case? And she said, you can't go to town in a bathtub. You can go to town if you have an automobile. But automobiles were cheap. You could buy automobiles and you could buy the products that you yourself was making. So there was that kind of loyalty to the plant that you made what you could buy. So that the prosperity of the 1920s was largely dependent on construction and also on automobile parts. And so Muncie was a prosperous community then. And I think in times of prosperity, unionization doesn't proceed very rapidly.
You also write about General Motors coming to town. The whole chapter GM comes to town. And so what we're talking about Warner Gear primarily, and that's the focus of our story, but still the auto industry, and particularly GM has a big role in the city as well. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that.
GM comes, there are a number of reasons that this happens because a lot of auto parts places spring up, a lot of factories when Durant goes broke, there are opportunities to buy up old plants. The skilled workers are already there. You can hire the people that have been working in auto plants. And people have the expectation of going into industrial work. There was a tradition in Muncie that if you worked at Warner Gear or another place, your son would probably go to work there. And there did seem to be a kind of family connection. I worked there for so many years. My son goes, it's a good job. We can make a vocation of it. So I think that adds to the predominance. You come where you can find a favorable industrial atmosphere. And the unions not being there, that helps too.
Yeah, we found the family connections and the generational connections, really important and common here. Very quickly, what happened to the interstate? I mean, I'm just curious. Muncie goes, initially as being a place, one of many places that are building cars. Particularly the interstate is perhaps the most successful of these particular models that are being built in the early 20th century, to being a place that goes to making parts of cars instead. So talk about the interstate and that transition perhaps a little bit.
The interstate was started after Muncie didn't get Maxwell. It was a pretty successful car. It had several new innovations that were in advance of the time. And actually, it started out as a kind of community effort among several entrepreneurs. And then it went broke. So it wasn't until about 1914 that the Balls got control of it and started making it. And it did very well until the war started. And they started to change their production lines to make trucks, artillery trucks, and other war equipment, and had just got it started when the war ended. They just geared into production, and they weren't producing cars. But some of the other car companies got the jump on them. They got out of the war production business faster. And so the interstate was faced with this problem. They would have to retool. They'd be behind. They didn't have a good distribution network. So they just gave up on the interstate. I think it was a problem of timing, problem of events at the particular end of the war.
Okay. So what do you think is there any importance to the fact that Muncie becomes a city that makes car parts instead of cars, becomes sort of a secondary node? Do you think that has mattered for the history of the city?
10 years, I think the city would have been different if it had made cars. Well, it did make cars in the 20s. I think if Durant had continued there, I think probably the plant would have shut down in the 30s. It shut down in the 20s, but I think it wouldn't have survived the 30s because of the Depression that forced a number of other car places out of business. I think they were more successful making parts than they were actually making all of the cars. I think they didn't have the financial infrastructure to sustain it, or the kind of transportation facilities and distribution facilities that Ford, for example, was able to work out, or Chevrolet, or General Motors in general. So I think it would have been a different place, but I don't think it would have survived.
You've spoken a couple of times about the pride workers had working at Warner Gear, and also you talked at different points about the role of innovation and in discussing things interviewing a number of people who worked at BorgWarner, both engineers and managers as well as workers. There's one of the themes that comes up is that they really were innovators, and there's a certain pride associated with the fact that this plant invented the differential gear, had a key role, as you said, in the automatic transmission. Several other iterations of the automatic transmission came out of the Warner Gear plant. So we've noticed this tradition of innovation and a pride in the work that's done there. Is that something you saw in your research?
Sure, yeah. They did indeed have a pride in what they did. And I think most of what they accomplished was on the line of a small improvement. It wasn't like the differential or like the automatic transmission. It just comes out of nowhere. It was largely an improvement on how we can produce a part or how we can make the part better. But that was a continuing reputation, and workers were proud of that. Yeah, that we save some money for the company. We make a better part. There was a pride of workmanship that existed. Yeah.
Do you think the move of control of the company out of Muncie to Chicago, and that sort of increasingly the Muncie plant is the subject of decisions made elsewhere, do you think that undercut that pride and that tradition of innovation?
I think that there's a change in atmosphere when the company becomes a more national company rather than a local company. There is a sense of distance. That is, you don't see the people who are the most significant if you're working on the floor now than if you had been working at an earlier time. So I think that does undercut it, yes.
Great. I want to just briefly talk about Middletown. Before I do, I noticed you did a series of interviews when you were preparing the manuscript you did for T.J. Ault, including interviews with him. And so I'm wondering, did you develop any personal stories, either of your own experience or other experiences?
Do I have a question?
Oh, no. I'm good.
So do you have any personal stories to tell us about BorgWarner workers, your own interactions with them? You know, the story about the salary of an assistant professor was good. Anything else along those lines?
In my last house that I owned in Muncie, the fellow across the street worked at Warner Gear. And he always looked down on me because he had more cars than I had. He had a riding mower on a small lawn, plus a gasoline-powered mower, and I had a gasoline-powered mower. And he was a member of the country club, which I wasn't. So I think he regarded me as maybe culturally or materially deprived. He, I think, lived a different kind of a life, but he was able to sustain that with what he did at Warner Gear.
You lived across the street from a line worker who was a member of the country club?
Maybe he played golf. I think he was a member. Maybe I should.
That don't qualify. It's a good story.
It may not be true. You know, he may not have been a member.
Golf.
He played golf. Yeah.
That's interesting. One quick other thing that occurs to me, and I've heard this elsewhere. You've been referring to the company chiefly as Warner Gear rather than BorgWarner. And when you talk to locals, when I talk to locals and I start talking about BorgWarner, they kind of look at me cross-eyed and they say, "No, it's Warner Gear."
Yeah.
Two things I wonder if you could talk about. One is, does Warner Gear, or what's the difference between Warner Gear and BorgWarner? Just sort of explain that. And two, why do you think it is that locals refer to Warner Gear as Warner Gear and not BorgWarner?
When the name was changed and BorgWarner took over instead of Warner Gear, the name never changed for people who work there. The long tradition was that it always had been Warner Gear. It had been Warner Gear, and it would remain so. There was always this local identification. I think the worker and members of the community, I never called it BorgWarner. I lived here over 30 years, and it was always Warner Gear. And, the sign didn't make any difference. It was still Warner Gear. And that's how I talked to people, and that's how people talk to me.
So we're now fast forwarding to 2009, and the plant is closed. And what would you say, looking back on this history, what would you say is the significance of the closing of Warren Gear for the community, people who work there?
I think that the closing of the plant means a change in the kind of community this will be. It will be a change from what used to be an industrial community, a Rust Belt town. I think if conditions are right, perhaps we could have a reindustrialization, maybe a different kind of reindustrialization based on a different technology. But I think that the community still has a number of people who look for some solution. They look for maybe a change in direction, and it won't be the same community, but it may still survive. That's the question, I think. Will it survive?
Just up the road here, at the intersection of Interstate 69 and 332 McGalliard, they are siting and will open next year a plant making gears for wind turbines. It's an Italian-owned company called Bravini. There's also a German-owned firm that's setting up shop in connection with them. What's your reaction to hear that there's a new gear company coming to town?
All during the recent recession and so on, people have been looking pretty desperately for some other solution to deindustrialization. I think it can be done. I have a question again, whether the conditions are going to be the same. That is, the competition is going to be worldwide. It's not going to be a competition within the Midwest, for example. You see windmills being built everywhere. You see them all over the world. And my wife is teaching a woman whose factory in China is producing solar panels. And the Chinese are proceeding very rapidly. I think it's going to have to be, again, an innovative kind of something that nobody else seems to have. I think it's possible to reindustrialize.
Do you think there's the kind of innovative tradition that we saw a century ago around now?
I think so. The culture is quite different, but I think that there's still that innovation, I think. We're kind of a society that rewards innovation. Whether or not there are people who are willing to stand that kind of life and competition is another question. Yeah.
We have a couple of small auto parts makers still operating locally, and then Bravini will be coming in. One thing these shops have in common is that they're non-union. Do you see any significance in that?
I think the days of ripe unionization are probably over too. When I was teaching in Budapest, I had people ask me why the America was so strong in the 50s and 60s. And the answer was we were producing things when nobody else could. They were still in the throes of World War II results. So I think we could go back to a earlier innovation, but the conditions aren't the same. We have a lot of other people who are innovative. We have a lot of other people who are intelligent and who are becoming educated and able to do what we thought we had a monopoly on some time ago.
What do you think is the significance for workers that these new jobs will be non-union?
I think it means we're going to have to figure out some way to get ahead. We're going to have to figure out some means of accomplishing what unions had accomplished in the past.
You started out with that saying, I think it means, but you say, I think that the absence of unions means, or something like that.
I think the absence of unions means that in the end, there are going to have to be other ways to provide for what the unions provided at the time. For example, I think we may have a health system that replaces the generous health systems that unions were able to provide. And I think that there will be other kinds of developments that may obviate the need for the kind of actions that unions took. I don't think it obviates the need for unions to look out for workers' welfare, but it may be that there may be other institutional ways to accomplish what unions have accomplished in the past. They may be more transitory or more permanent than we now know, which is a neat hedge, or hedge anyway.
We won't put that in. I hope I'm not wearing you out. I just got.
Well, I've got to leave before noon because my
We'll be
wife,
done before then.
okay, I had to check out of the motel.
Okay. How about 10 minutes on just Middletown?
Okay,
We want
sure.
perhaps to talk about Middletown in the fall.
Okay.
You guys got enough tape here?
Yeah, we have plenty.
And there's just a few things I wanted to draw out of you about Middletown. The first is, if you could just talk briefly about what Middletown is, how it came to be, who the Linds are.
Middletown was an industrial community that,
Sorry, the book, I mean, not so much the city.
Yeah.
Okay, excuse me.
okay, Muncie was an industrial community that was chosen by the Linds to represent a Midwestern manufacturing city. The beginnings of the study of the town were the result of industrial conflict, mainly the Cripple Creek massacre in 1915. Rockefeller, not the original John R., but his son, was very much concerned with industrial peace and the divide between workers and capitalists. And he proposed a unification of all the Protestant churches in America. This unification didn't come off, but as a result of this and as a result of early surveys, Rockefeller decided to put up the money to have a study of an industrial city. And he chose, in this case, Muncie, Indiana. The man who was chosen to make the study and his wife were actually not sociologists or anthropologists. Lind was actually the son of a banker who grew up in the Midwest, who actually studied theology, and was chosen because Rockefeller liked the way he performed in the oil fields in the West. So Lind came to Muncie and did a survey that was a survey similar to what anthropologists had been doing, asking what happened in the particular community in a number of categories. He and his wife came to Muncie in 1925. They studied the town intensely with a number of assistants. They wrote a book in 1929 that they entitled Middletown, which was the first longitudinal or first study to examine an American industrial community in this fashion. Middletown became an instant success. It's still in print after all these years. Lind came back to Muncie in the early 1930s to see the impact of the Depression on the city. His wife did not come. The study was a smaller study. It was entitled Middletown in Transition and came out in 1937. It was not as popular nor was it as well done. The study has continued in the late 1970s, early 1980s, a team from University of Virginia, headed by Ted Kaplow, a sociologist, did a restudy of the community, looked at a number of features, looked at religion, for example, and a variety of others. In addition to this, there was a documentary film series on PBS entitled Middletown, which was a study based again upon the book and the researches that had preceded it.
That was great. One thing, you talked about the Lynns. Could you just craft a sentence that says Robert and Helen Lynn wrote
Okay.
Middletown, something like that,
Yeah.
just for film's purpose. Whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I'm ready whenever you are.
In 1925, Robert Lynn and his wife, Helen Lynn, came to Muncie, set up shop with a number of assistants, and researched the town, examining a variety of sources and doing a variety of interviews. Their results of their studies were published in a book in 1929 called Middletown.
Perfect. Just a few things about what the Lynns found in both books. How would you summarize their assessment of the impact of industrialization on the community?
The interest of the Lynns, both in Middletown and Transition, were the same thing. They were impressed by the extent to which industrialization had not really changed the basic ideology of the people in the community. They held on to ideas that the Lynns regarded as passé. During the Depression, for example, Robert Lynn found that people still held on to the ideas that you ought to be an individual, you controlled your own destiny, when he believed that obviously that was not the case. So the books really show a dichotomy with what the Lynns believed the situation in Muncie was and what the people in Muncie believed.
Yes, exactly. Sounds like one of my talks.
Yeah.
The Lynns spend a good bit of time describing work life. How would you summarize their depiction of the life of people working in industry in Muncie?
They found a real division between the working class and I've forgotten what they call it, the white collar class, the business class.
So maybe start again.
Okay, the Lynns found a real division between the working class and the business class and their habits and their beliefs and so on. He found, for example, how much more time they had, how much more educated the business class was, and how much time the working class had to put in doing certain things that the business class was able to take advantage of leisure activities. The working class relied more on family affairs and so on.
So the family was a more significant part of the lives of workers?
Yeah.
And then one last bit on the Lynns in Middletown. One of the things they noticed, of course, is the absence of unions.
Mm-hmm.
So could you comment on that and what they found in that regard?
The Lynns pretty much felt that the ideology that people held kept them from organizing, that they were blocked in a sense not only by the attitudes of the business class, but partly because they shared the same attitudes that the business class had toward work. They were still caught maybe in an agricultural age when hard work would make you get ahead. They still held fast to the American dream that you could work your way up into a different social class.
Great.
Mm.
Yeah, and of course that ties in with the strategy of the businesses
Yeah.
to bring in these kinds of people who think this way, so that's not an accident. That's,
Yeah.
that's the way it is.
Yeah.
So, and that's an interesting background for some of what we're talking about. That's all I have
Good.
on my list. Before we wrap it up, though, if there's anything you think I should have asked that I haven't, or anything else you want to add, now's your chance to get it on the record.
I don't think so.
I tried to do that. So
I apologize, my memory hasn't been as good as it should have been.
it was awfully good.
I think it sounded great, yeah.
Yeah, it sounded good, and you covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
It was very helpful. Thank you.
It's been a while since I've done that study.
Yeah, it's always when you're being interviewed, you have to stop and compose your
Yeah.
thoughts.